The year was 1837, and the British Empire stood on the threshold of an era that would reshape not only the island nation, but the very world it touched. A young Queen Victoria, just 18 years old, ascended the throne with a sense of duty that masked her youth and uncertainty. Her reign would span more than 60 years and come to define an entire century under her name, the Victorian era. This was a time of iron and empire, of lace and labor, a time when England transformed from a modest European kingdom into a global titan of power, commerce, and culture. As the young queen sat in her gilded throne in Buckingham Palace, thousands of miles away, British merchants, missionaries, and military forces were carving up continents in the name of trade and sovereignty. Back home, the wheels of industry turned with relentless momentum. In Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, the air choked with smoke and soot bore witness to a revolution unlike any the world had seen before. The Industrial Revolution had found its heart in England, and it beat ferociously in every factory floor, every rail track laid, and every steamship launched across foreign seas. England became the workshop of the world, churning out textiles, steel locomotives, and telegraph, wires that connected distant lands and ideologies together in a rapidly shrinking world. This technological supremacy was not born in silence, but amidst the roaring of machines and the cries of child laborers who toiled for long hours under the watchful eyes of factory owners seeking profit over humanity. While the aristocracy enjoyed tea and porcelain cups and spoke of progress and destiny in parlors lined with oil paintings and gilded mirrors, the working class drowned in overcrowded slums where disease, hunger, and hopelessness festered beneath the cobblestone streets. Yet it was precisely this contradiction that defined the Victorian character, a relentless march forward despite the suffering left in its wake. In the realm of thought and art, England thrived. Charles Dickens painted portraits of the neglected and oppressed, exposing the cruelty of industrial capitalism, while Alfred Lord Tennyson gave voice to the dreams and doubts of a changing world. Charles Darwin, in A Quiet Corner of Cambridge, scribbled ideas that would challenge centuries of religious doctrine with his theory of evolution, even as clergymen preached the divine right of empires from pulpits across the kingdom. The empire itself expanded with imperial arrogance and logistical brilliance. Ships bearing the Union Jack sailed to India, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, where colonies were built not just with guns but with railways, schools, and courtrooms. British civil servants rewrote laws, reshaped customs, and introduced parliamentary systems in lands that had their own ancient traditions. The sun never set on the British Empire, not merely because of its vastness, but because its influence stretched into the very fabric of colonized societies, transforming diets, dress, languages, and even dreams into reflections of the imperial center, London, with wealth pouring in from colonial exploits from the rubber plantations of Malaya to the tea estates of Ceylon. England indulged in architectural and cultural grandeur. Victorian Gothic cathedrals rose beside Romanesque relics, gaslights flickered along foggy streets, and Queen Victoria herself became a symbol of motherhood strength and divine right. But the empire was not unchallenged beneath. The sheen of dominance unrest simmered. Irish famine fueled resentment and migration. Indian mutinies exposed the brittle underbelly of colonial rule, and revolutions in thought and labor began to shake the stability of English society. The working poor, emboldened by new political philosophies and the spread of education, began to organize, form unions, and demand rights that had long been denied to them. Women, too, began to question their place in society, inspired by reformers and suffragettes, who saw in Queen Victoria's own reign the possibility of female power in a man's world. The Victorian home, long idolized as the sanctuary of morality and order, began to crack as questions of gender, class, and race flooded public consciousness. In science, literature, fashion, and governance, the Victorians walked a tightrope between tradition and transformation, holding in one hand the Bible and in the other Darwin's Origin of Species. They built museums to preserve the past while investing, in schools to ignite the future. They raised statues to military heroes while burying dissenters under political silence. Yet through it all, the image of England remained potent and magnetic to much of the world. England was not merely a country. It was an idea, a structure, a system that promised civilization, but delivered it with conquest that preached virtue while profiting from vice. Even those who resisted British rule could not escape its influence, and many who suffered under its yoke later used its own tools, language education, legal frameworks to demand freedom and dignity. The Victorian era was an age of paradox, where advancement coexisted with atrocity, where the poor starved in alleys while the elite dined under chandeliers, and where a queen reigned over an empire too large for any one monarch to truly grasp. By the end of this first phase of Victoria's reign, England had become a symbol of modernity, and might London had grown into the heartbeat of a global system. And the British people, whether noble or commoner, rich or destitute, believed with fervent pride that their nation stood as the guiding light of the modern world, even as that light cast long shadows across the lands it claimed, and the people it governed. By the time the 1850s arrived, England was no longer merely a European power. It was the axis upon which the world seemed to spin. The expansion of the railways allowed people, goods, and ideas to move faster than ever before, connecting rural landscapes with industrial cities and colonial ports with the heart of London. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace of Hyde Park, was the ultimate symbol of Victorian pride and progress, with thousands of displays from across the globe showcasing British manufacturing, colonial resources, and the intellectual genius of the era. Queen Victoria, accompanied by Prince Albert, stood as the proud matriarch of this global family, welcoming dignitaries, inventors, and entrepreneurs into the glittering glass cathedral of industry and innovation. Yet behind this grandeur was a darker reality that the empire often sought to hide. The very colonies that provided England with tea spices, silk, and labor were also places of exploitation, rebellion, and unrest. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, brutally crushed by British forces, revealed how thin the veneer of control truly was and how deeply resentment against imperial policies had taken root among local populations. In Ireland, famine and forced emigration continued to ravage communities while debates raged in Parliament about reform responsibility and the burden of empire. But the empire did not pause for self-reflection. It pushed forward. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 transformed trade routes, making British control over Egypt and access to India. Even more critical, strategic dominance was the name of the game, and the Royal Navy, with its ironclads and global reach, ensured that England stayed several steps ahead of its European rivals, especially France and Russia. As the empire expanded, so did British influence in art, fashion, science, and morality. The Victorian gentleman and lady became archetypes of refinement, courtesy, and discipline. Portraits of the royal family adorned parlors across the empire, and etiquette manuals sold in droves, instructing colonists and commoners alike on how to sit, dress, dine, and pray like the English. Meanwhile, in universities and salons, minds like Florence Nightingale pioneered modern nursing. John Stuart Mill challenged norms of liberty and utilitarian ethics, and scientists mapped the human body, stars, and atoms with increasing precision and obsession with classification and control. Even entertainment was not spared from the shadow of empire. Adventure novels like those of Rudyard Kipling and H. Rider Haggard romanticized colonial conquest, while Gothic tales from Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker reflected the anxieties of a society haunted by the very forces it sought to dominate. The Victorians feared what lay beyond the familiar, not just in the jungles of Africa or the deserts of India, but within the human soul itself. Even as science explained more of the world's, spiritualism, seances, and the supernatural found an eager audience, especially among the upper classes, seeking comfort in a rapidly changing society. At home, reforms began to slowly shift the political landscape. The second Reform Act of 1867 extended voting rights to portions of the working class, stirring hopes for a more representative government, though true democracy was still a distant dream. The rise of the Chartist movement and the pressure from trade unions signaled that the common people were no longer content to be silent spectators in the grand theater of empire women, too found their voices louder as writers, campaigners, and educators like Mary Wollstonecraft's intellectual descendants pushed against the chains of domesticity. While Queen Victoria herself held conservative views about a woman's place, her very position as sovereign challenged the notion that politics and power belonged solely to men. In the streets of London, the echoes of empire were heard in every corner. Opium from China, ivory from Africa, diamonds from South Africa, and spices from India all flowed through the ports into the homes of the middle and upper classes. Goods that had once been luxuries became symbols of status and British superiority. Even the very language of empire saturated daily life with phrases like the white man's burden and civilizing mission, used to justify domination and cultural erasure abroad. And yet, for all its might, the British Empire in the mid-Victorian period remained fragile, dependent on the loyalty of its colonies and the obedience of its people. The working classes began to question why they bore the brunt of labor, while aristocrats reaped the rewards. Irish nationalists, Indian intellectuals, African kings, and Caribbean thinkers began to resist, not only militarily, but philosophically, seeking to reclaim their narratives and assert their agency in a world that painted them as subjects, not citizens. The Victorian world was increasingly a house of mirrors where illusion and reality blurred, where the same hand that built railways also destroyed villages, and where the light of progress cast shadows. No one wanted to admit the streets of London were paved with gold for some, but for many, they were pathways of sorrow, where chimney sweeps, orphans, prostitutes, and paupers lived and died unseen by those in carriages above. The idea of the empire as a family was fiction to most of its members, but fiction the British believed in fervently, and fiction they taught to their children in schools adorned with maps that showed half the world in red. As the 1870 dawned, the empire appeared indomitable. Queen Victoria celebrated 33 years on the throne and was increasingly revered as a near-divine figure. The royal family became the face of English identity and a symbol of stability in a world forever changing. But underneath the gaslights and behind the marble columns, the empire faced questions that no throne could silence and no army could fully suppress. What did it mean to be English? What did it cost to rule the world, and how long could the empire keep growing before it began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? As the 1880s unfolded, the British Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, painting vast swaths of the globe in imperial red and asserting its dominance not only through warfare and trade, but also through the relentless spread of British institutions, education systems, and legal frameworks. The Crown's influence extended from the icy reaches of Canada to the sun-scorched plains of Australia, from the highlands of East Africa to the crowded ports of Hong Kong and Bombay. British officials were appointed as governors, judges, educators, and engineers, bringing with them a rigid system of administration that mirrored that of Whitehall and Westminster. This expanding network was both admired and feared, a testament to the empire's efficiency and its insatiable appetite for control. At home, the mood was a mix of triumph and tension. The urban centers of Britain teemed with activity and innovation, fueled by an expanding middle class, eager to prove their worth in a society that still clung to aristocratic privilege. The rise of department stores, public parks, and the proliferation of newspapers created a more connected and consumer-driven population. Technological marvels, such as the telephone, electric light, and underground railway, reshaped everyday life and offered new ways of experiencing the world. The Victorians were obsessed with measurement, classification, and order. They sought to categorize everything from species in the natural world to social classes in the human one. This drive for control extended into the very households of England, where strict gender roles and moral codes dictated the behavior of men, women, and children. The patriarch was sovereign in his home, the mother a moral compass, and the children, miniature adults molded for discipline and duty. Yet beneath this surface order were the tremors of resistance and reinvention. The literary world had begun to challenge traditional narratives with figures like Thomas Hardy, Oscar Wilde, and George Eliot peeling back the curtain on Victorian hypocrisy and revealing the human cost of repression and societal expectation. While sermons continued to thunder from pulpits across England, a growing number of intellectuals began to question the Church's authority and relevance. The tension between faith and reason reached a boiling point as the century neared its close, and science, philosophy, and secularism took root in public consciousness. The working class, increasingly restless, pushed for more political representation, fairer wages, and safer working conditions. Labor strikes became more frequent and organized, and the fear of socialist revolution began to creep into the drawing rooms of the elite. Meanwhile, women no longer, content with their roles as silent companions, fought for visibility and voice. The formation of suffrage movements and educational campaigns for girls marked a turning point in gender politics. The image of the angel in the house was fading, replaced by women who marched, wrote, protested, and demanded the right to be seen and heard beyond the parlor walls. The empire, too, was changing, as resistance movements grew more sophisticated and more vocal. In India, a new generation of educated leaders began to articulate a vision of self-rule that challenged British paternalism. In Africa, the so-called scramble among European powers intensified, with Britain claiming territories through diplomacy and brute force, but encountering fierce resistance from local kingdoms and warriors who refused to yield quietly to imperial ambitions. The morality of empire was increasingly questioned, not just by those it subjugated, but by citizens at home who began to see the costs of conquest in terms of human lives and ethical compromise. The Second Anglo-Afghan War, the Zulu War, and the crushing of uprisings across the colonies painted a bloody picture of what British dominance truly required. In the face of all this, Queen Victoria remained a stoic figure who had grown from a teenage monarch to the grandmother of Europe. Her personal tragedies, the loss of Prince Albert in 1861 and the subsequent years of mourning, only seemed to enhance her image as a dignified and devoted ruler detached from the petty politics of the day and elevated into a symbol of empire stability and moral certainty. Her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 celebrated 60 years of her reign with pageantry that spanned continents. 1 million people lined the streets of London to catch a glimpse of the aging Queen carriages filled with colonial soldiers, diplomats, and nobles paraded through the capital, and telegrams of loyalty flooded in from every corner of the empire. The event was both a culmination and a curtain call, a grand display of unity and power, masking the fractures growing beneath the surface. The Jubilee's spectacle could not erase the mounting tensions within the empire, nor could it still the voices rising from every colony demanding dignity, respect, and autonomy. The truth was that England's dominance, while vast, was not eternal, and its golden century would end, as all ages do, in the quiet cracking of the illusions that once held it together. In the final years of Victoria's reign, the air in Britain grew heavier with doubt. The Boer Wars in South Africa revealed the cruelty of British policies, including the use of concentration camps, which horrified the public and tarnished the image of imperial righteousness. The glories of conquest were being rewritten as tragedies, and the dream of a benevolent empire seemed less convincing with each passing day. The next generation of leaders, intellectuals, and citizens would inherit a world, both shaped and shadowed by the decisions of this era. The Victorian spirit, so confident and commanding, was now gazing into a future it could no longer predict or dominate. As the 1890 gave way to the dawn of the 20th century, the final chapter of the Victorian era unfolded with a curious mixture of grandeur and unease. The empire that had once seemed invincible now showed signs of exhaustion, stretched thin by its own ambitions and challenged by the very people it had long claimed to civilize. In the drawing rooms of England, debate stirred about the ethics of colonial rule, the cost of foreign wars, and the responsibilities of power. The newspapers that had once cheered British expansion now printed harrowing accounts from the front lines of South Africa, where the Boer War dragged on, exposing the brutal tactics of the British military and the suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire. The romanticism of empire began to unravel under the weight of real stories of hunger, dislocation, and death. The working class at home continued to rise in strength and solidarity, fueled by education exposure to politics and a growing sense of injustice. Trade unions flourished and strikes became tools of protest as laborers demanded fair pay, reasonable hours, and humane treatment. The new century loomed large over the industrial skylines of cities like Sheffield, Leeds, and Glasgow, where factories still belched smoke into the skies, but now faced challenges not only from within, but also from emerging industrial powers like Germany and the United States, who were catching up and in some cases surpassing British productivity. The question of England's future dominance became more pressing in intellectual circles. The Victorian need for classification and control gave way to experimentation and rebellion. Artists, poets, and thinkers broke away from strict moral codes, embracing aestheticism, symbolism, and psychoanalysis. The novels of the late Victorian period grew darker, more introspective, less certain of the future. Authors, like Joseph Conrad and Thomas Hardy, wrestled with the emptiness beneath imperial pride and the futility of human control over fate. Sigmund Freud's theories began to circulate, quietly in coffee houses and academic salons, challenging everything Victorians had believed about rationality, morality, and the self. The rise of spiritualism and occult societies revealed a population that, despite its scientific advances, still longed for connection with the unseen, with mystery, with meaning, beyond what factories and logic could provide. The empire was no longer just a geopolitical entity. It had become a psychological one, deeply embedded in the English psyche, defining identity, worth, and destiny for both ruler and ruled. And yet those ruled increasingly refused to be silent. Subjects in India, Egypt, Ireland, and the Caribbean began forming political parties, publishing newspapers, and organizing movements demanding independence, or at the very least recognition and reform. Indian leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Gopal Krishna Gokhale emerged as voices of resistance within a system that had taught them the English language, English laws, and English history. Only to deny them equality within it, Ireland simmered with discontent and dreams of home rule, while Africa reeled from the consequences of the Berlin Conference, which had carved up its lands without consent and pitted rival groups against one another under the banners of empire. The Queen herself, now in her 80s, remained revered but increasingly symbolic. Her influence waned in matters of policy and law as Parliament took greater control and as figures like Prime Minister William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli clashed over the direction of foreign and domestic policy. Yet Victoria's image was everywhere, etched into coins, stitched into banners cast in bronze and marble across 5 continents. Her very presence was political, a reminder of the world Britain had built and the order it insisted upon maintaining. But that order was cracking. The women's suffrage movement grew bolder, staging public demonstrations, publishing provocative essays, and demanding inclusion in the nation's democratic processes. The idea that women should have a vote was once ridiculed. Now it was unavoidable. Social reformers tackled poverty, illiteracy, and child welfare with a new sense of urgency, inspired not just by Christian charity, but by a growing belief in social responsibility and systemic change. The science that had once promised progress and power now revealed complexities and consequences that left the public both awed and alarmed. X-rays, wireless telegraphy, and new chemical compounds opened doors to innovation and danger, while the mechanization of warfare hinted at the horror to come. The end of the century brought no clear resolution, only a deepening awareness that the Victorian age was not eternal, that its values, institutions, and ideologies would not remain unchallenged forever. In 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her family and the weight of an empire she had helped shape for more than 63 years. Her death marked more than the end of a reign. It marked the end of an era. The world mourned with elaborate funerals, parades, and tributes, but underneath the mourning lay a sense of change that no crown could stop. A new king took the throne, and with him came a new century and a new world. The Victorian era had been one of expansion, industry, certainty, and control, but its final days revealed the limits of all those things. Its legacy would endure in railways and legal codes, in novels and museums, in both the pride of England and the pain of its former colonies. It had built much, but it had also broken much, and the century to come would be shaped not only by what the Victorians had created, but by what they had failed to imagine and what they had refused. To see the passing of Queen Victoria in 1901 did not simply end a reign. It closed the book on a century defined by ambition, contradiction, and transformation. The Victorian era had reshaped the world, placing Britain at the pinnacle of global influence. But that very dominance had sown the seeds of future unrest, rebellion, and realignment. The empire she left behind was vast and glittering, but also restless and splintered in identity. The 20th century began not with the same certainty that marked its predecessor, but with a questioning gaze turned inward and outward alike. New voices emerged, not just in Britain, but across the former silent corners of the empire, calling for reform, recognition, or outright independence. From India came an increasingly coordinated push, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, who had absorbed the English language, English law, and English education, but now turned those tools against the very power that had delivered them. In Ireland, the call for home rule turned into an armed struggle for self-determination, while in Africa, the forced partitions and cultural displacements began giving rise to a generation that would remember the pain of empire longer than its promises. Even in Britain, the proud heart of the empire, the air of superiority began to thin. The industrial cities that had driven the empire's wealth now faced competition from rising global powers. The United States and Germany surged ahead in manufacturing innovation and military strength, while Britain's own working class demanded not only better wages, but greater representation in Parliament. The Labour Party emerged from the discontented margins of Victorian society to become a force that could no longer be ignored. This was a nation standing at the edge of modernity, carrying with it the weight of a century spent building and ruling, but unsure how much longer that rule would last. The advances of the Victorian age had left an indelible mark on the world, but they were also proving to be double-edged. The same railways that carried goods from distant colonies also transported armies and revolutionaries. The same legal systems imposed on colonies became the foundation for lawsuits against Britain itself. The English language, once a tool of cultural dominance, became the weapon of resistance, as colonized intellectuals wrote back to the empire in its own tongue, exposing its hypocrisies and reclaiming their stories. The Victorian sense of moral righteousness faltered in the face of new philosophies, new art, new science, and above all, new perspectives, no longer content to be dictated to by London. The moral clarity of the past century gave way to ambiguity, the grandeur to guilt, and the unshakable confidence to a nervous awareness that history would judge not only the achievements of empire, but its cruelties as well. In universities across the empire, young minds debated not whether Britain had brought civilization, but whether that civilization was worth the blood it had spilled to impose itself. In literature, novels once centered on the heroism of empire now told stories of its collapse and decay. In politics, nationalism, socialism, feminism, and anti-imperialism gathered momentum with ferocity born of decades of exclusion and injustice. The Victorian era had established systems and structures that would long outlive it, but it could not contain the human yearning for freedom, nor could it silence the generations rising to demand a world not built on hierarchy, but on equality and voice. The image of Queen Victoria, once ubiquitous and unquestioned, began to fade into the background, replaced by a more critical reckoning with what her empire had meant to those who lived beneath its rule. Her statues remained, but the ideas they represented began to erode under the weight of wars, resistance, and reformation. In the decades to follow war would deal a massive blow to British global dominance, shaking the economic and moral foundations of the empire and accelerating the push for independence across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The Victorian dream of eternal rule vanished. In the trenches of France and the deserts of Mesopotamia, as soldiers from the colonies fought and died for a crown that still denied them full humanity, the sun that had famously never set on the British Empire began to descend, not suddenly, but inevitably. The Victorian era would live on in museums, in laws, in literature, and in memory, but not as an unquestioned golden age. Rather, it would become a contested legacy, admired for its ambition and innovation, but critiqued for its exploitation and inequality. It gave the world railroads and revolutions, steamships and suffrage factories and famine. It shaped the course of history, but it did not escape the consequences of its own contradictions. The century of English dominance had ended, and in its wake came a world forever changed, one that would continue to grapple with the gifts and ghosts of the empire that once ruled over it all.